Listen closely. Can you hear it? The sharp, final crack of a gavel echoing through a silent, wood-paneled courtroom. It is a sound that seals a fate, that ends a world. For one man, that sound wasn't just a legal verdict. It was the violent shattering of an entire existence. Picture a life of unimaginable privilege, of ancestral castles and unquestioned power, a name whispered with reverence for centuries. Now, imagine it all gone in an instant, splashed across the front pages of every newspaper, reduced to a scandalous headline declaring the utter downfall of a duke. This is where our story begins, not at a glorious beginning, but at what seemed to be a humiliating public end. It's a tale that feels almost Shakespearean in its tragedy. A nobleman cast out from the very society he was born to rule. But what if I told you that this moment of disgrace was not an ending, but the most unlikely of beginnings? What if the ashes of that ruined life were the very soil from which something profoundly powerful and unexpected would grow? This is the incredible journey of a man who plummeted from the pinnacle of aristocratic privilege to the absolute depths of public shame. He had known a world of gilded cages and velvet ropes, where every desire was anticipated and every problem could be solved with a name or a fortune. Yet, stripped of his titles, his wealth, and the respect he had always taken for granted, he was forced to confront a question few of us ever have to answer. Who are you when everything you believed defined you is taken away? This is not merely a story of losing a dukedom. It is a story of finding a soul. It's a narrative that delves into the darkest corners of human failure and soars to the heights of personal redemption. A transformation so radical, it seems to defy the very laws of social physics. We are about to trace his path from the opulent ballrooms of the elite to the gritty front lines of social justice. A path littered with betrayal, self-discovery, and ultimately, a purpose that would redefine his life. We often hear stories of reinvention, but rarely one with stakes this high or a transformation this complete. This is a journey that challenges our deepest assumptions about identity, second chances, and what it truly means to lead a meaningful life. How does a man bred for entitlement learn the language of empathy? How does someone who once looked down upon the world from a position of immense power find his true strength by standing alongside the powerless? We will explore the scandals that shattered his gilded world, the years of struggle that forged a new perspective, and the passionate activism that became his unlikely legacy. So settle in and prepare to discover a story of radical change, a testament to the human spirit's astonishing capacity for renewal. This is more than history. It is a powerful reminder that sometimes our greatest triumphs are born from our most devastating failures. To understand the sheer magnitude of his fall, we must first appreciate the dizzying heights from which he fell. He was not merely born into wealth. He was born into a form of American royalty, a world where the very air seemed gilded. His arrival into the world was not just a birth, but an accession. The next in an unbroken line of power and prestige that stretched back to the founding of the nation. His family's fortune, colossal even by the extravagant standards of the Gilded Age, was built on a foundation of railroads, steel, and banking, the very engines of modern America. Their name was synonymous with influence, whispered in the corridors of political power, and celebrated in the social columns of every major newspaper. His childhood was a world unto itself, a life lived within the sprawling confines of opulent estates that were more like small, private kingdoms. Imagine a boy growing up not in a house, but in a palace, with hallways so long his footsteps would echo, surrounded by masterpieces of art that were simply part of the furniture. His daily reality was one of profound insulation from the ordinary. He was raised by a small army of staff-devoted nanas who catered to his every whim, stern tutors who drilled him in Latin and history, and grooms who taught him to ride on horses worth more than most families' annual income. Every meal was a formal occasion, every summer a grand tour of European capitals, every winter a season of glittering balls where the elite of society gathered. This was not just luxury, it was a complete ecosystem of privilege designed to perpetuate itself. From his earliest moments, the weight of his lineage was impressed upon him. He was not an individual with personal dreams, but the heir to a legacy, a living vessel for a name and a title that carried immense expectations. His future was not something to be discovered or built. It was a pre-written script. He would attend the right schools, marry the right woman from an equally powerful family, take his seat in the boardrooms and gentlemen's clubs, and eventually assume the mantle of leadership over the family's vast empire. The concept of failure, of not meeting these expectations, was simply unthinkable. It was a gilded cradle, beautiful and imposing, but also a cage that defined his every thought and action. He was taught to see the world from a position of inherent superiority, to believe that his station in life was a matter of destiny, not chance. This insulated existence, while providing every material comfort, created a fundamental disconnect, a chasm between his perception of reality and the lives of the millions whose labor supported his world. He was a prince in a republic, and for the longest time, he saw no contradiction in that at all. And into this rarefied world, a new force of nature would arrive, one who seemed to embody its very contradictions. She was not a European aristocrat, but an American heiress, a woman whose family fortune was so new and so vast that it practically crackled with energy. If the Duke's world was one of old, settled power, hers was a world of dynamism and ambition. She was what the press of the day had christened a dollar princess, the daughter of a self-made industrial titan, a man who had built an empire from railroads or steel. Her father's wealth could buy anything: palaces, art, political favor, but it could not buy the one thing he craved most for his family: the unassailable respectability of an ancient title. And so a transaction was arranged, not of money for money, but of new money for old prestige. Their meeting was practically orchestrated by the invisible hands of social ambition, likely set against the most extravagant backdrop imaginable. Picture a summer night in Newport, Rhode Island, at one of the colossal cottages mansions so immense they were palaces in all but name. The air is thick with the scent of salt and gardenias, the night alive with the soft murmur of an orchestra and the clinking of champagne glasses. Or perhaps it was in London during the height of the season, in a ballroom dripping with crystal and gold leaf, where the air hummed with the tension of carefully negotiated introductions. There, across a crowded room, their eyes would have met. He would have seen a vision of cultivated beauty, a woman whose gown undoubtedly cost more than a tradesman's annual earnings, yet whose confidence had a distinctly American boldness. She possessed a freshness, an energy that stood in stark contrast to the sometimes jaded elegance of the European ladies he knew. And she would have seen in him the very embodiment of what her family had crossed an ocean to find: a duke, the apex of the aristocratic pyramid. He was tall, undoubtedly, with the easy grace of one born to command. His title an invisible aura that set him apart from every other man in the room. It was a collision of two worlds, a moment charged with the unspoken understanding of what this union represented. For her, it was a crown, the ultimate validation of her family's rise. For him, it was a solution, a magnificent infusion of capital that could shore up the crumbling foundations of his ancestral estates, restore the family art collection, and maintain a lifestyle that his inherited wealth could no longer sustain on its own. It was a fairy tale, yes, but one with a balance sheet attached, a merger of bloodline and bottom line that would bind their destinies together in the most public and precarious of partnerships. The union was celebrated as the wedding of the century, a spectacle of almost mythic proportions that captivated the public's imagination. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic competed to describe the opulence in breathless detail. The ceremony itself was held in a grand cathedral, the bride a vision in lace and silk, the duke every inch the storybook nobleman. Thousands of onlookers lined the streets just for a glimpse of the carriages, while the guest list read like a directory of global power: kings, industrial magnates, and political leaders all in attendance. The reception that followed was a testament to excess, with mountains of flowers, fountains of champagne, and a wedding cake so enormous it seemed a feat of architectural engineering. For the cheering crowds and the avid readers of the society pages, it was a real-life fairy tale, a perfect merging of American new money vitality and European old-world elegance. But behind the dazzling facade, the reality was far more calculated. Long before the first invitation was engraved, teams of lawyers and financial advisors had been locked in quiet, intense negotiations. The bride's father, a man who had built his fortune on ruthless deals and sharp instincts, was not simply giving his daughter away. He was making a strategic investment. The price tag for the duke's title was staggering, amounting to millions of dollars in today's money. This colossal sum was not a simple gift. It was a dowry meticulously structured to pay off the mountainous debts that threatened to consume the duke's ancestral estates. It would fund urgent repairs to centuries-old castles, restore art collections that had been pawned, and replenish coffers drained by generations of aristocratic living. In return, the duke's family offered the one asset they had left that the industrialist could not manufacture: their unimpeachable social standing, a title that stretched back into history. This financial arrangement cast a long shadow over the couple's life from the very beginning. While the public saw a romance, those within their inner circle understood the transaction. The heiress had been raised to see marriage as a strategic alliance, the ultimate duty to secure her family's legacy. The duke, for his part, had been raised to understand that his primary responsibility was to preserve his lineage and property, even if it meant marrying for money rather than love. The coldness of this bargain became apparent in the subtle dynamics of their relationship. Their public appearances were perfectly choreographed, a display of unity for the cameras, but in private, the gap in their backgrounds and temperaments was vast. He was reserved, shaped by centuries of tradition and a sense of entitlement that was second nature. She was often bold and outspoken, a product of a society that valued ambition and individual merit. They were two people playing roles scripted for them by forces larger than themselves, bound together not by passion, but by a contract that valued prestige and capital above all else. The very foundation of their marriage was this quiet, unspoken agreement, a gilded cage they had both willingly entered, yet one that would leave them emotionally isolated amidst unimaginable material splendor. For a time, the pages of that social contract seemed to hold firm, and the world they built together was one of breathtaking spectacle. As the new Duchess, she did not simply join his world, she amplified it, pouring her considerable energy and her father's seemingly endless resources into creating a lifestyle that was the envy of two continents. They became the ultimate power couple, their names a byword for a kind of glamour that was both ancient and modern. Their existence was a perpetual grand tour, a migration between palatial homes that spanned the globe. There was the ancestral castle in the English countryside, its medieval stones now gleaming after a costly restoration, its vast grounds manicured to perfection. There was the magnificent townhouse in London's most exclusive square, a beacon of elegance during the social season. And then there was the Newport cottage, a sprawling marble palace by the sea that was, in every way, a deliberate and triumphant declaration of American wealth, standing proudly alongside the summer homes of the Astors and the Vanderbilts. Each of these residences was a stage for their life, and they performed their roles with flawless precision. Their days were a whirlwind of curated activity. Mornings might be spent receiving guests in sun-drenched salons, afternoons dedicated to riding through private parks or attending exclusive polo matches. But it was the evenings that truly defined their reign. Their parties became the stuff of legend. Imagine a ball where the guest list included not only the cream of European aristocracy, but also titans of American industry and even visiting royalty. The women shimmered in diamonds that had been in families for generations, or, just as often, were fresh from the workshops of Cartier, paid for with new fortunes. The air was thick with the scent of thousands of hothouse flowers, specially imported to fill every room. Orchestra music floated through corridors lined with old master paintings, while servants in immaculate livery circulated with trays of champagne and delicacies. The press couldn't get enough of them. They were permanent fixtures on the front pages, their every movement chronicled with breathless admiration. A photograph of the Duchess stepping off an ocean liner in a new Parisian gown could set fashion trends for a year. A report on the Duke's speech at a charitable gala was treated with the gravity of a state address. They were the original influencers, their taste and their opinions carrying immense weight. Their patronage could make an artist's career or secure the future of a museum. They moved in a rarefied circle, a gilded international set where last names like Rothschild, Rockefeller, and Romanov were simply friends and acquaintances. In this world, problems were solved with a discreet phone call. Scandals were hushed up by powerful friends, and the future seemed as secure and predictable as the turning of the seasons. From the outside, their life appeared to be a perfect, unassailable fortress of privilege, a testament to the idea that blood and money, when combined, could create an existence insulated from the ordinary troubles of the world. It was a brilliant, dazzling performance, and for a long while, it seemed they would be the stars of this show forever. Yet beneath the dazzling surface of this seemingly perfect world, fissures were beginning to form tiny cracks in the gilded facade that would soon widen into chasms. The first signs of trouble were subtle, little more than a whisper on the wind in the exclusive clubs and drawing rooms where their friends gathered. It started with the Duke's gambling, what had once been a gentleman's pastime, a way to wager modest sums among peers at a weekend house party, began to escalate into something far more compulsive and dangerous. The stakes grew higher, moving from friendly games of cards to high stakes, betting on horse races and reckless investments in speculative ventures that seasoned financiers would have avoided. The losses began to mount, reaching sums that were alarming even for a man of his means. These weren't just debts that could be quietly settled with a check. They were obligations to shadowy figures in Monte Carlo or London's underworld, men who did not accept excuses and demanded payment on time. At the same time, whispers about his personal conduct began to circulate. There were tales of late-night escapades in the less savory districts of Paris, of companions who were most certainly not his wife, and of a growing fondness for brandy that seemed to be moving beyond social lubrication into a genuine dependency. The very traits that had once been charming his devil-may-care attitude, his sense of entitlement, his boredom with the strictures of high society, were now curdling into something darker and more self-destructive. He was becoming erratic, missing important social engagements or arriving in a state that raised eyebrows. The careful, polished performance he and his wife had maintained for years was starting to look frayed at the edges. The press, which had once been their greatest cheerleader, began to sense a shift in the wind. The fawning society columns that chronicled their every move started to carry a new, more inquisitive tone. A paragraph about a lavish party might now include a pointed question about who exactly was footing the bill. A photograph of the Duke looking disheveled leaving his club late at night would be published with a caption that was less about his style and more about his apparent condition. The reporters who had been kept at a respectful distance began to dig deeper, chasing down leads about unpaid bills from tailors and wine merchants, or interviewing former staff members who might be willing to share an unflattering anecdote for a price. The brilliant, untouchable image of the Duke and Duchess was developing its first faint stains in a public that had adored them for their perfection was beginning to develop a taste for the drama of their potential downfall. The fairy tale was showing its first crucial cracks, and everyone was starting to watch, waiting to see what would happen next. The tipping point arrived not with a slow unraveling, but with a single catastrophic explosion that lit up the social sky like a firework and turned the Duke's world to ash. It was a financial scandal of such audacious proportions that it dwarfed all the previous whispers about his gambling and drinking. Driven by a desperate need to recoup his mounting losses, and perhaps to prove he was more than just a caretaker of inherited wealth, he made a fateful decision. He convinced his wife to grant him access to a significant portion of her dowry, the very fortune that had been intended to secure their future and restore his estates. With this capital, he plunged into a speculative venture that promised astronomical returns, a scheme involving dubious overseas mines or a revolutionary, but untested new technology. He invested not just money, but the entire family's financial security, leveraging their assets to a breathtaking degree, convinced that his aristocratic intuition was as good as any financier's analysis. The scheme, of course, was a house of cards. When it collapsed, it did so with a speed and totality that sent shockwaves through 2 continents. The news broke not in a private letter, but on the front page of every major newspaper. Headlines screamed of the massive loss, revealing the staggering sum that had vanished and exposing the Duke's profound recklessness. The most damning detail, the one that sealed his social fate, was the source of the money. The press revealed that it was his American wife's fortune, the new money, that had saved the old name that he had so carelessly squandered. This transformed the story from a simple tale of financial misfortune into a profound moral failure. He hadn't just lost his own money, he had betrayed the sacred trust of the marriage alliance, violating the unspoken code of his class. The very peers who had tolerated his eccentricities turned on him with cold fury. He was now seen as a fool and a cad, a man who had jeopardized the sanctity of aristocratic agreements for a reckless gamble. The doors of London's most exclusive clubs were closed to him, and invitations that had once flowed like water dried up overnight. The personal fallout was immediate and brutal. His relationship with his wife, already strained by his behavior, shattered completely. The financial trust between them was irrevocably broken, and the public humiliation she endured was immense. She was left not only heartbroken, but financially vulnerable. Her future, and that of any children they might have had thrown into jeopardy by her husband's actions. The scandal also triggered a cascade of legal and financial consequences. Creditors he had been keeping at bay descended like vultures, demanding immediate payment on his now unpayable debts. Lawsuits were filed, and the threat of complete financial ruin, of losing the ancestral homes he had sought to save, became a terrifying reality. The gilded life he had known evaporated in a matter of weeks. The glittering parties were replaced by tense meetings with lawyers, the admiring gazes of society by the accusing stares of reporters and former friends. He was utterly alone, exposed and disgraced, a pariah in the very world he had been born to rule. This was the moment the title of Duke became a hollow echo, a prefix to a name now synonymous with failure and shame. The snubbing began almost immediately, a social death administered not with a bang, but with a chilling, silent consensus. The telephone at their London townhouse, which had once rung incessantly with invitations, fell silent. The engraved cards that once filled a silver tray on the mantelpiece simply stopped arriving. It was a form of ostracism so complete, it was almost surgical. Former friends, men he had known since his school days, would cross the street to avoid having to acknowledge him. At the opera, the boxes adjacent to theirs would remain conspicuously empty, a void of velvet and gilt that spoke louder than any boo. Ladies who had once competed for a place next to the Duchess at dinner parties now turned their backs when she entered a room, their silence a weapon more cutting than any insult. This was not the heat of anger, but the deep freeze of disapproval from a society that valued its own preservation above all else. He had broken the code, and for that, he was now invisible, a ghost haunting the very spaces he had once dominated. The press, of course, had no such reservations about making him visible. They descended with a ferocity that was both brutal and gleeful. The respectful tone of the society pages was replaced by savage caricatures in the popular illustrated newspapers. Artists depicted him as a gaunt, foolish figure, his aristocratic nose exaggerated, his eyes blank, often shown losing a pile of gold coins to a caricatured figure of Uncle Sam, symbolizing the squandered American fortune. He was drawn fleeing from a pack of creditors or hiding behind his wife's skirts. The headlines were even more direct, labeling him the bankrupt duke or the disgraced nobleman. Every humiliating detail was dredged up and published. The unpaid bills from his tailor, the lawsuits filed by minor creditors, the rumors of his drinking. The public that had once adored him now devoured every sordid chapter of his downfall. He became a cautionary tale, a spectacle of hubris for the masses to dissect over their morning tea. The formal institutions of the establishment moved more slowly, but with even greater finality. One by one, the positions and honors that had defined his public role were stripped away. A discreet letter arrived, informing him that his membership in his most exclusive gentlemen's club had been revoked. Then came notice that his honorary colonelcy of a prestigious regiment was being rescinded. His name was quietly removed from the boards of the charitable foundations and cultural institutions he had once patronized. These were not just titles. They were the scaffolding of his identity, the official recognitions of his place in the world. Their removal was a systematic dismantling of the man he was supposed to be. He was left with nothing but his name, and even that was now a punchline. The final, humiliating act was the decision to leave. Remaining in England became unbearable, a daily torture of whispered insults and averted gazes. The ancestral estate, once a symbol of permanence, now felt like a gilded prison, its empty halls echoing with his failure. The decision to go into a form of exile was an admission of total defeat. Their departure was the opposite of their grand arrivals. There was no cheering crowd, no flurry of press cameras capturing their elegant travel attire. They left under a cloak of gray anonymity early on a damp morning. A single carriage carried them and a handful of trunks to a waiting steamship, the same kind of vessel they had once crossed on amidst great fanfare. As the coastline of England faded into the mist, it wasn't just a country he was leaving behind. It was his entire past, his birthright, and every assumption he had ever held about himself. He was now a man without a country, without a society, and without a role, cast adrift on the open sea with only the crushing weight of his disgrace for company. The first few months in exile were a study in sensory deprivation, a life stripped of all its familiar noise and grandeur. The modest villa they rented, tucked away on a quiet lane in a forgotten corner of the Italian countryside, or perhaps a sleepy town in upstate New York, was a universe away from their palatial homes. The air didn't carry the murmur of fountains or the scent of hothouse flowers, but the simple smells of earth and local cooking. The silence was profound, broken not by the clip-clop of carriage horses or the chatter of a dozen servants, but by the wind in the trees or the distant church bell marking the hours. For a man whose life had been a constant performance, This sudden, crushing anonymity was a shock to the system. To the local shopkeepers and neighbors, he was just another foreign gentleman of uncertain means, a Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones. The weight of his title, which had defined every interaction since birth, was gone, leaving a strange, hollow feeling. He was a ghost, unseen and unrecognized, and in that emptiness, he had no choice but to confront the man who remained. His initial state of mind was likely a volatile and painful cocktail of emotions. There would have been towering waves of bitterness, a deep-seated resentment toward the society that had cast him out so completely. He might have replayed the scandal in his mind endlessly, searching for a moment he could have changed, or seething at the hypocrisy of those who had once fawned over him. This bitterness could easily have curdled into a profound despair, a feeling of being utterly finished at a relatively young age, with no schedule, no obligations, and no audience. The days stretched out before him in a terrifying blankness. The purpose that had been drilled into him, to uphold the family name, was now impossible to fulfill. What was he to do with himself? Who was he supposed to be? This existential crisis, this confrontation with a meaningless future, was perhaps the most frightening aspect of his new reality. The grand tragedy of his life had played out on a world stage, but the aftermath was a quiet, private agony. Yet intertwined with the pain, there might have been another, more surprising sensation, a faint, unfamiliar sense of relief. The Gilded Cage, for all its splendor, had been a prison of expectations. The constant pressure to perform, to uphold centuries of tradition, to be the perfect duke at all times, had been an immense, unspoken burden. Now that burden was lifted. The social calendar that dictated his every move was blank. The disapproving eyes of his peers were thousands of miles away. For the first time in his life, he was free from the script. There was a brutal honesty to his new obscurity. No one was impressed by him anymore. No one was trying to use him for his connections or his title. This raw authenticity, while painful, offered a strange kind of liberation. He could, in theory, be whoever he wanted, though he had no idea who that might be. The challenge was no longer about managing a vast estate or maintaining a public image, but about the far more fundamental task of simply learning how to live. This profound isolation, this quiet emptiness, became the fertile ground for a shift he could never have anticipated. The transformation didn't begin with a thunderclap of revelation, but with a slow, creeping awareness born from the simple, unvarnished reality of his new life. For the first time, he was living without a buffer. There were no servants to shield him from mundane chores, no secretaries to handle unpleasant correspondence, no social secretaries to curate his world. He had to go to the market himself, to stand in line at the post office, to negotiate with a local handyman over a leaking roof. In these ordinary spaces, he was just another man, and it was here that his insulated world began to crack. His initial encounters with genuine hardship were likely accidental, yet deeply jarring. Perhaps it was during a walk through the poorer quarters of the nearby town, where the sharp, clean air of the countryside gave way to the smell of coal smoke and crowded humanity. He would see faces etched with a kind of weariness he had never known. Men whose hands were calloused from a lifetime of labor. Women aged prematurely by constant worry, children running barefoot through muddy streets. These were not the abstract, poor he had occasionally donated to from a great distance. These were people with lives, stories, and struggles happening right outside his door. He might have witnessed a scene that stuck with him. A family being evicted from their cramped lodgings, their few meager possessions piled on the street, or a factory worker coughing violently, his lungs ruined by years of breathing in industrial filth. These images stood in stark, uncomfortable contrast to the memory of his own excess. The thousands spent on a single party now seeming grotesque when measured against the price of a loaf of bread. This new perspective was undoubtedly sharpened by his own reduced circumstances. While he was by no means destitute, the constant anxiety over money, the need to budget carefully, and the humiliation of having to deny himself things that were once taken for granted gave him a tiny, fractional taste of the economic precariousness that was a daily reality for millions. He was learning in a very personal way what it felt like to have your security vanish, to be vulnerable to forces beyond your control. This personal experience of loss became a bridge to empathy. He could no longer dismiss poverty as a moral failing or a simple lack of ambition, because he himself had fallen from a great height through a combination of his own mistakes and the ruthless judgment of society. He started to see the systems at play, the way wealth protected some and crushed others, the indifference of the powerful to the suffering of the powerless. The scales were falling from his eyes, not all at once, but in a series of quiet, unsettling moments that forced him to question everything he had ever been taught about his own inherent superiority and the natural order of things. It began almost as a form of private therapy, a desperate need to make sense of the wreckage his life had become. In the quiet solitude of his exile, he started to write. Not the polite, formal correspondence expected of a man of his station, but long, rambling, and fiercely honest letters to the few acquaintances who had not completely abandoned him. These letters became the testing ground for his new, still forming convictions. At first, they were filled with the expected bitterness, a litany of complaints against the specific individuals who had wronged him. But as the months passed, the tone of his writing began to shift. The focus moved from personal grievance to a much broader and more damning critique. He stopped arguing that he had been treated unfairly by a just system and started to argue that the system itself was fundamentally unjust. He turned his analytical gaze, once trained on bloodlines and estate management, onto the very architecture of aristocratic power. In his letters, he would dissect the concept of inherited privilege with the precision of a surgeon. He wrote that it was a monumental absurdity, a violation of any reasonable notion of merit or justice, to grant a human being vast wealth, political influence, and social supremacy based solely on the accident of their birth. He argued that this system didn't just benefit the unworthy, it actively corrupted them. It created a class of people so insulated from consequence, S.O. Chinese letter, E.D., by unearned adulation, that they were incapable of developing genuine character, empathy, or even basic competence. He was, in essence, writing a psychological and moral indictment of his former self. He described the deep-seated boredom, the restless search for sensation, and the underlying insecurity that festered beneath the polished surface of a duke's life, a life where every achievement felt hollow because it was preordained, and every challenge could be circumvented by wealth or title. This intellectual rebellion soon found a voice in his conversations. When rare visitors came to his modest home, the talk was no longer of hunting seasons or London gossip. He would steer discussions toward politics, philosophy, and the great social questions of the day. His guests, perhaps expecting a broken man longing for the past, would instead encounter a fiery polemicist. He would speak with startling passion about the plight of industrial workers, drawing parallels between their powerlessness against factory owners and his own former power over the tenants on his estates. He acknowledged that while he had once seen those tenants as a benevolent patriarch sees his children, he now understood that such a relationship, however well-intentioned, was inherently degrading. It denied people their full autonomy and dignity. He began to champion the ideas of social reformers and progressive thinkers, men and women he would have dismissed as radicals just a few years earlier. He argued for progressive taxation, for public education, for the right of workers to organize, positions that were anathema to the aristocratic class he had left behind. This was more than just a change of opinion. It was a profound act of self-erasure and reconstruction. By rejecting the values of his birthright, he was systematically dismantling the internal framework that had supported his identity for decades. It was an excruciating process, like learning to walk again after a spinal injury. Every cherished assumption had to be questioned, every reflexive judgment examined and often discarded. The man who emerged from this crucible was barely recognizable from the disgraced duke who had gone into exile. The haughty posture was replaced by a thoughtful intensity. The sense of entitlement had been burned away, leaving in its place a hard-won humility and a burning desire to understand the world as it really was, not as it appeared from the balcony of a palace. He was shedding his past not out of spite, but as a necessary step toward building a future that had meaning, a life grounded not in privilege, but in principle. The cause that ultimately captured his soul and gave his fragmented life a new, powerful direction was the brutal struggle for workers' rights. It was not an abstract intellectual choice, but a deeply personal resonance that drew him in. After his own catastrophic financial collapse, he had experienced, in a small way, the terrifying precarity of being at the mercy of powerful, impersonal forces. He knew what it felt like to have your livelihood threatened, to face the humiliating scrutiny of creditors, to feel the ground of security vanish from beneath your feet. This personal understanding became the key that unlocked his empathy for the industrial working class, whose entire existence was defined by that same precariousness, but magnified 1,000-fold and without any of the safety nets his background had once provided. His interest was first piqued not in a grand lecture hall, but through the gritty reality of his new surroundings. Living in a modest town, he could not help but observe the daily rhythms of the working people around him. The factory whistle that dictated their lives, the tired, soot-stained faces trudging home at the end of a 12-hour shift. He began to read the local newspapers with a new focus, poring over reports of labor disputes, factory accidents, and the desperate pleas for better wages and safer conditions. The more he learned, the more he saw the chilling parallels between his own story and theirs. He had been ruined by a single, reckless gamble. These men and women lived with the constant gamble of illness, injury, or economic downturn that could starve their families. He had been cast out by a rigid social system for breaking its rules. They were trapped by an economic system that seemed designed to keep them in their place. The moment of true conversion likely came when he witnessed an event that crystallized this abstract injustice into a vivid human drama. Perhaps it was a local strike where he saw workers, their faces a mixture of determination and fear, standing on a picket line facing down hired security forces. Or maybe he read a searing account of a factory fire where workers had perished because the owners had locked the doors to prevent theft. The specific tragedy isn't as important as the visceral reaction it provoked in him. He recognized in the workers' struggle the same fight for dignity that he himself was waging internally. Their demand for a living wage echoed his own desperate need to find a purpose that wasn't measured in pounds and pence. Their fight against powerful, unaccountable industrialists mirrored his own resentment toward the aristocratic establishment that had exiled him. This was the profound connection. He realized that the unearned privilege he had enjoyed was simply one end of a spectrum of injustice, and the exploitation of the worker was the other. The same system that granted him a dukedom by accident of birth condemned a child to a life in a coal mine by that same accident. He saw that the casual entitlement of the ruling class, a trait he now understood intimately, was the direct cause of the suffering he was now witnessing. This realization burned away any remaining self-pity and replaced it with a clear, burning sense of mission. He wasn't just a fallen aristocrat seeking redemption. He was a man who had seen the inner workings of power from both sides and now felt a moral imperative to use that unique knowledge to speak truth to that very power. The pen that had once written letters filled with bitterness now began to draft passionate essays and speeches, not about his personal grievances, but about the universal right to a dignified life. He had found his cause, and in doing so, he had found the first solid ground he had stood on in years. His first real step into this new world was not a grand public declaration, but a quiet, almost furtive act of courage. The contrast could not have been starker. Instead of entering a grand hall through towering oak doors, he likely found himself slipping through a side entrance into a dimly lit, smoke-filled room above a pub, or in the back of a trade union hall. The air, thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and damp wool, was a world away from the perfumed salons of his past. He would have taken a seat in a shadowed corner, his collar turned up, perhaps even using a simple pseudonym, Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones, to hide the infamous name that had once opened every door in Europe. In that room, he was not a duke. He was just another face, anonymous and unremarkable. The very act of being there, of willingly placing himself in this unfamiliar and potentially hostile environment, required a profound bravery of a kind he had never needed before. This wasn't the courage of a duel or a hunting expedition. It was the far more vulnerable courage of humility, of admitting he had something to learn from the very people he had been taught to ignore. He would have listened, truly listened, for the first time in his life. The speakers were not polished orators, but working men and local organizers, their voices rough, their language direct and full of the grit of everyday struggle. They spoke of things he had only ever read about, of wages that didn't cover the rent, of children pulled from school to work, of bodies broken by unsafe machinery. He heard stories of layoffs right before the holidays, of families evicted for protesting, of the constant, grinding anxiety that defined their existence. What must have struck him most powerfully was the stark difference between this raw, unvarnished truth and the sanitized, abstract discussions of the poor that had occasionally taken place over port and cigars in his former life. In those drawing rooms, poverty was a problem to be solved, a topic for charitable concern. In this cramped room, it was a lived reality, a palpable emotion of anger, fear, and desperate hope. He was not observing from a distance. He was immersed in the human consequence of the economic systems he was beginning to question. His initial contribution was equally modest, a testing of the waters. Perhaps it was a carefully written letter to a radical newspaper, submitted under a pen name, that articulated a simple but powerful argument for fair wages. Or maybe it was a small, anonymous donation to a strike fund, money that would buy food for families who had lost their income for standing up for their rights. For a man who had once thought nothing of losing a fortune at a casino, the sum would have been insignificant, but the gesture was monumental. It was an act of solidarity, a tangible signal that he was aligning himself not with power, but with the powerless. He was not yet ready to attach his disgraced name to the cause, and that hesitation itself speaks volumes about the immense psychological leap he was taking. He was navigating a precarious line, trying to find a way to be useful without allowing the spectacle of his past to overshadow the gravity of the present struggle. These small, anonymous acts were the first tentative stitches sewing the torn fabric of his life into a new pattern, one where his purpose was defined not by what he was born into, but by what he had come to believe in. The moment he decided to step out of the shadows and speak in his own voice was a turning point that would redefine his life. It likely began with a quiet invitation, perhaps from a local organizer who had come to respect the thoughtful Mr. Smith, who asked such penetrating questions. They might have approached him after a meeting, saying, "You understand these matters better than most. The men need to hear this. Will you speak at the rally next week?" The decision to accept would have been agonizing. It meant shedding the protective cloak of anonymity and publicly attaching his notorious name, his disgraced title, to a cause that was anathema to his former peers. The risk was immense. It would be seen as the ultimate betrayal by the aristocracy and could invite ridicule or even danger. But the alternative, remaining silent while the injustice he now saw so clearly continued, had become unbearable. He agreed. His first public speech was not delivered from a grand podium, but probably from a simple wooden crate or the steps of a public building. His audience a sea of working men and women whose faces were a mixture of skepticism and hope. He would have been intensely nervous, his hands perhaps trembling as he unfolded his notes, the crisp accent of his education sounding alien in the open air. But as he began to speak, something remarkable happened. He did not talk down to them or offer patronizing sympathy. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He apologized. He acknowledged the privilege he had been born into, confessed his own past ignorance, and stated clearly that he had been a part of the problem. This act of humility immediately disarmed his listeners. He was not a savior descending from on high. He was a fellow traveler on the road to justice, one who had started from a very different place, but had arrived at the same destination. The core of his argument was devastatingly effective because it was rooted in insider knowledge. He began to articulate a critique that no factory worker or union leader could have made with the same authority. "I have sat in the drawing rooms of the powerful," he would tell them. "I have heard them speak of you not as human beings with dreams and families, but as hands, as labor costs, as variables in an equation designed for their profit. They believe their wealth is a sign of their virtue and your poverty a sign of your failings. But I am here to tell you that this is a lie." He would then dissect the mechanisms of power with the precision of someone who had once wielded it. He explained how laws were crafted in private clubs to protect property over people, how the press was often manipulated to portray strikers as ruffians, and how the entire system was designed to make the concentration of wealth seem natural and inevitable. His speeches were masterclasses in demystifying the elite, pulling back the curtain on the casual cruelty and intellectual arrogance that sustained inequality. His greatest asset was his ability to frame the workers' struggle not as a narrow economic dispute, but as a fundamental moral crusade for human dignity. He drew on his classical education, referencing philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to argue that the right to a safe job and a living wage was a natural right, not a charitable handout. He would contrast the gilded indolence of the aristocracy with the productive dignity of the laborer, arguing that it was the worker who created real value, while the idle rich merely consumed it. "They inherited their castles," he would thunder, "but you build them with your own hands. They inherited their fortunes, but you create wealth with your sweat and skill. So I ask you, who is more truly noble?" This rhetorical framing was electrifying. It gave the movement a language of righteousness that resonated far beyond the picket lines, appealing to the conscience of a broader public. As his confidence grew, so did the sophistication of his advocacy. He began writing blistering pamphlets and letters to newspapers, now proudly signing them with his full name and title. This was a calculated act of defiance. By using the very title that had been his mark of shame, he turned it into a weapon. Editors could not ignore a piece on labor reform written by a duke, even a disgraced one. His articles were widely read, sparking outrage and debate in circles that would have otherwise dismissed the cause. He became a bridge between worlds, translating the raw grievances of the workers into a language that the educated and powerful could understand, while simultaneously articulating the principles of justice in a way that galvanized the masses. He was no longer a spectator or an anonymous supporter. He had found his voice, and in doing so, he had become one of the movement's most unlikely and compelling champions. He possessed a weapon that no other activist in the movement could claim, and it was the very thing that had caused his downfall: his name. The title of Duke was a double-edged sword, a brand of notoriety he could never fully shed. While he had rejected the system it represented, he made a pragmatic and brilliant decision. He would not hide from it. Instead, he would wield the attention it commanded as a tool, turning the symbol of his old privilege into an engine for his new purpose. This was a masterstroke of strategic reinvention. When a leaflet was distributed announcing that His Grace, the Duke of, would be speaking at a rally for dock workers, it created a sensation. The sheer incongruity of it was irresistible. For the press, it was a far more compelling story than yet another Union speech. It was a spectacle, a shocking twist in an ongoing societal drama. For the wealthy industrialists he now opposed, it was an unnerving development. This wasn't some radical firebrand they could easily dismiss. This was one of their own, a man who knew their secrets and spoke their language, now turning his insider knowledge against them. He leveraged this access with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. Where other reformers were barred from the offices of powerful newspaper editors or politicians, he could often secure a meeting simply by sending a letter on stationery that still bore his crest. The door would open out of a mixture of morbid curiosity and lingering, almost reflexive, deference to his rank. Once inside, he would not plead or beg. He would argue with the cool, authoritative logic of a boardroom executive. He could dissect an opponent's economic argument with a precision born of a lifetime managing vast estates and complex finances. He would frame the demands of the workers not as a threat to the social order, but as a necessary adjustment for its long-term stability, appealing to the self-interest of the powerful by warning of the greater danger of widespread unrest. His arguments carried a unique weight because they came from a peer, and his conversion lent an undeniable credibility to the cause that it had previously lacked. He was living proof that the fight for justice was not just a matter of class envy, but a moral imperative that could resonate across the deepest social divides. Perhaps his most powerful act was the way he consciously subverted the expectations of his title. When he stood on a platform, he was not there as a benevolent aristocrat condescending to help the poor. He was there as a penitent, as a witness for the prosecution against the system that had created him. He would often begin his speeches by acknowledging the irony. "You see before you a duke," he would say, his voice carrying the unmistakable tones of an elite education. "I was raised to believe that my blood made me special, that my title made me your natural superior. I am here today to tell you that I was wrong. My greatest education did not come from Oxford or from the halls of my ancestors. It came from walking among you and seeing the true source of nobility. It is found in courage, in solidarity, in the dignity of honest labor." This rhetorical move was devastatingly effective. It disarmed skepticism and created an immediate bond of authenticity. He wasn't just speaking about injustice. He was embodying the possibility of redemption and radical change. By using the symbols of the old world to dismantle its very foundations, he became more than just a speaker. He became a powerful symbol himself, a walking, talking contradiction that forced everyone who encountered him to question their most basic assumptions about power, worth, and the very meaning of aristocracy. And what of the Duchess during this extraordinary transformation? While the Duke was finding his voice in union halls and on street corners, his wife was facing her own profound crisis. Her journey is a fascinating, often overlooked counterpoint to his very public redemption. When the scandal broke and they fled into exile, she was not just a bystander to his disgrace. She was its most prominent victim. The fortune she had brought into the marriage, the dowry that was meant to be her security and her children's inheritance, had been vaporized by her husband's recklessness. The public humiliation she endured was uniquely cruel. Portrayed in the press as the naive American heiress, swindled by a decadent European nobleman. One can only imagine the turmoil within her. The betrayal, the anger, the sheer panic about a future that had, in an instant, gone from guaranteed opulence to terrifying uncertainty. Initially, her response was likely one of survival. The first years of exile would have been a period of intense strain on their marriage, while he was descending into his own private hell of bitterness and then emerging with a new philosophical fire. She was grappling with the practical realities of their reduced circumstances. The arguments must have been fierce. How could she support a man whose actions had obliterated their shared life, the safe, predictable path, the one expected by her family and former social circle, would have been a clean and decisive break? She could have returned to New York, perhaps to the forgiving embrace of her father's wealth, and attempted to rebuild her life away from the toxic shadow of his title. Many in her position would have done exactly that, and few would have blamed her. Yet, the evidence suggests a more complex and intriguing story unfolded. Rather than a swift departure, there are indications of a gradual, perhaps reluctant, evolution in her stance. She did not immediately leave him. Instead, she remained by his side in their modest exile, a decision that speaks volumes. At first, her presence may have been rooted in a sense of duty, or even a lack of alternatives, but over time, something shifted. She witnessed his transformation firsthand. She saw the arrogant, self-destructive man she had married become someone else entirely. A man humbled, thoughtful, and consumed by a passion for justice that was entirely alien to the world they had both known. Or she might have expected to see a broken shell. She instead saw a man being reforged with a newfound strength and purpose. Her perspective on his activism would have been uniquely conflicted. On one hand, it must have been a source of profound embarrassment. The very notoriety he was courting was a constant reminder of their shared scandal. For a woman raised to value propriety and social standing above all else, his very public alliance with radical causes would have felt like a further renunciation of the life she had been taught to desire. Yet, on the other hand, she could not have missed the positive change in him. The restless energy that had once been channeled into destructive gambling was now directed toward a cause. The apathy and entitlement had been replaced by a vibrant, compelling sense of conviction. The man who emerged from his despair was, in many ways, a better, more substantial person than the one she had originally married. There are tantalizing hints that she may have moved from mere tolerance to active, if quiet, support. Perhaps she began by proofreading his pamphlets, her sharp eye for detail catching errors his passion might have missed. Maybe she used her own formidable social skills, honed in the ballrooms of 2 continents, to help him navigate his new alliances with union leaders and reformers, advising him on how to present his arguments more effectively. In the later years, some accounts suggest she may have even accompanied him to certain events, not as a speaker, but as a dignified, silent presence at the back of the hall. Her mere attendance would have been a powerful statement, a quiet signal of solidarity that would not have been lost on observers. She never became a public figure in the movement herself. That would have been a step too far for a woman of her background, but her sustained presence by his side suggests a private conversion, a slow and steady realignment of her own values. Her story becomes one of a different, more private kind of courage, the courage to stay, to witness a partner's radical change, and to quietly, faithfully help build a new life from the ashes of the old. Word of his activism, of course, traveled back across the Atlantic with the speed of a steamship, carrying scandal into the very heart of the world he had left behind. The reaction from his former peers was not merely disapproval. It was a fury that bordered on the apocalyptic. To them, his advocacy for workers' rights was not a principled stand. It was the ultimate act of treason. He had not just fallen from grace. He had actively taken up arms against the very class that had created him. In the rarefied air of London's gentlemen's clubs and the country houses where the elite gathered, his name was now spat out like a curse. He was no longer just the disgraced Duke. He was the traitor Duke, a turncoat who was poisoning the minds of the masses with dangerous ideas. Their outrage was rooted in a profound sense of betrayal. The aristocracy operated on a code of silence, a mutual understanding that their disputes and failings were to be handled discreetly, behind closed doors. By taking his grievances public and aligning himself with the working class, he had shattered this most sacred rule. He was airing their dirty laundry for all to see, exposing the mechanisms of power and privilege to the harsh light of public scrutiny. It was as if a general had defected to the enemy camp and begun revealing all the battle plans. They saw his actions as a personal attack on each of them, a threat to the entire social order that granted them their power. The fact that he used his insider knowledge to make his arguments so effectively only made his betrayal feel more intimate and more dangerous. The campaign to discredit him was swift and merciless. The same society pages that had once chronicled his every move now became a weapon. Articles painted him as mentally unstable, a man driven mad by his losses, his ideas dismissed as the ramblings of a broken mind. They whispered that his conversion was not genuine, but a cynical ploy for attention, a pathetic attempt to remain relevant after his social death. More viciously, they attacked his character, digging up every old rumor about his gambling and infidelities to prove he was a man without honor, whose opinions on morality were therefore worthless. The goal was to isolate him completely, to make him a pariah not just socially, but intellectually, so that his words would carry no weight with anyone of consequence. They aimed to box him into a corner with the radicals, ensuring that polite society would never have to take his arguments seriously. This social ostracism now took on a new, more political dimension. Any lingering hope of an eventual, quiet return to England was extinguished forever. It was made clear, through formal letters and informal channels, that he was persona non grata. His name was struck from guest lists with a finality that was absolute, but the ostracism extended beyond mere snubs. Powerful friends of the aristocracy who held influence in government and the media worked actively to undermine his efforts. Newspaper editors who might have been sympathetic to labor reform were pressured to refuse his articles or to bury them in obscure sections. Politicians who considered meeting with him were warned that such an association would be political suicide. They used their considerable influence to create a wall of silence around him, hoping to suffocate his message by denying it a platform. Yet, perhaps the most telling reaction was the cold, condescending pity mixed with fear. Some of his former acquaintances would shake their heads and sigh, speaking of him as a tragic case, a man who had gone native and lost his sense of self. This attitude revealed their deepest anxiety. They feared his example. If a man born to such privilege could reject it so completely, what did that say about the legitimacy of that privilege itself? His journey was a living refutation of the idea that bloodline equaled virtue or intelligence. It suggested that the entire edifice of aristocratic rule was built on a fallacy. This was far more threatening than any radical pamphlet written by a lifelong socialist, because it came from within their own ranks. His courage was not the courage of someone with nothing to lose, but the far more terrifying courage of someone who had lost everything of value in the old world and had found something more meaningful in the new. Every speech he gave, every article he published, was a silent challenge to every duke and earl who heard of it, a question they dared not answer. If your way of life is so just and noble, why did one of your own abandon it for the picket line? Among his many efforts, one campaign stands out not for its scale, but for its profound human impact, a fight that perfectly illustrated the power of his unique voice. It was the struggle of the railway signalmen, a group of workers whose plight seemed, at first glance, a narrow industrial dispute. These men worked in lonely signal boxes along the nation's rail lines, responsible for the safe passage of thousands of passengers every day. Their job demanded constant, unblinking attention, yet they were forced to work shifts of 12, 14, even 16 hours at a stretch for a pittance of a wage. Exhaustion was baked into the system, creating a terrifyingly real risk of catastrophic accidents. When they finally organized and threatened to strike, the railway companies and their allies in the press mounted a fierce campaign of character assassination, painting the signalmen as greedy and irresponsible, willing to hold the entire country's transportation system hostage for their own selfish gains. It was at this critical moment that the Duke stepped into the fray. He did not simply issue a statement of support. He immersed himself in their world. He arranged to meet with a delegation of the signalmen, not in a formal office, but in a humble meeting hall near the rail yards. He listened for hours as these weary men, their hands still smudged with grease, described the soul-crushing fatigue, the fear of making a fatal mistake, and the desperation of trying to feed their families on their meager pay. He understood that this was not just an argument about wages and hours. It was a fundamental question of whether a human being's right to rest and dignity was more important than a corporation's right to maximum profit. His contribution was a masterpiece of strategic advocacy. He penned a devastating open letter, which was published in several major newspapers. He began not by attacking the railway barons, but by appealing to the shared experience of every person who had ever traveled by train. Every man and woman who places their safety and the safety of their loved ones into the hands of a railway company, he wrote, has a vested interest in the alertness of the signalman. You trust that the man in the box is not nodding off from exhaustion, that his eyes are clear and his mind is sharp. The current system betrays that trust. It gambles with human lives to save a few pounds on the payroll. This framing was brilliant. He reframed the signalmen's strike from an act of aggression into an act of public service, a necessary stand for the safety of every citizen. Then he deployed his insider knowledge with surgical precision. He revealed that he knew for a fact that the directors of the railway companies would never subject themselves or their families to the brutal conditions they imposed on their workers. He detailed the lavish salaries and bonuses these executives awarded themselves, contrasting their lives of comfort with the grinding poverty of the men upon whom public safety depended. This is not a matter of economics, he concluded. It is a matter of morality. It is the age-old arrogance of power, the belief that the lives of the working class are cheap and expendable. The letter caused a sensation. It was reprinted in pamphlets and distributed at railway stations across the country. It gave a powerful, respectable voice to the signalmen's cause, shifting public opinion dramatically in their favor. Faced with this mounting pressure and the unanswerable logic of the argument, the railway companies were forced to the negotiating table, resulting in a landmark agreement that established safer shift limits and better pay, a victory that saved untold lives and became a model for future labor reforms. This campaign showcased his greatest strength, the ability to take a specific injustice and illuminate the universal principle it violated, using the language of the powerful to champion the cause of the powerless. The life he now embraced demanded a steep and continuous price, one paid not in currency, but in comfort, security, and peace of mind. The financial hardship was the most immediate and relentless pressure. While he was not destitute in the way the workers he championed were, the genteel poverty of his exile was a constant source of strain. The vast, effortless wealth that had once insulated him from every worry was gone. Now every expense had to be considered. The modest income from what remained of his wife's settlement or from small, anonymous writings was stretched thin, often diverted to support strike funds or to print pamphlets for the cause. He lived in rented rooms, his surroundings a world away from the gilded halls of his past. The starkness of this contrast was a daily meditation. Where once a staff of dozens anticipated his every need, he now mended his own clothes, cooked his own simple meals, and worried about the cost of coal to heat a single room through the winter. This was not the romanticized poverty of a bohemian artist. It was a grinding, practical struggle that required a level of personal resourcefulness he had never been required to develop. Beyond the financial strain lay a more insidious burden, the loss of privacy and the ever-present threat of danger. His high-profile defection had made him a target. The industrial magnates and political figures he challenged did not take his opposition lightly. He was almost certainly placed under surveillance. Private detectives hired by corporate interests would have tracked his movements, noted his associates, and attempted to dig up any information that could be used to discredit him further. His mail was likely opened, his conversations in public spaces monitored. This constant sense of being watched eroded the simple freedom of walking down a street unnoticed. Furthermore, the threat of physical violence was very real. The tensions during strikes could erupt into riots, and he, as a prominent speaker, would have been a visible target for hired security forces or angry mobs stirred up by anti-union propaganda. The luxurious security of his former life, where personal safety was guaranteed by teams of servants and the unspoken rules of his class, had been replaced by a pervasive vulnerability. Every time he stepped onto a platform to speak, he was taking a risk that the Duke of old would never have contemplated. Perhaps the deepest and most personal sacrifice was the profound social isolation. He had been cast out by the aristocracy, But his new allies, the workers and radicals, could never fully embrace him as one of their own. There was always a distance, a lingering awareness of his origins. However much they respected his courage and appreciated his voice, he would always be the tough who had joined their side, a permanent object of curiosity. He could never share their childhood memories, their cultural touchstones, or the deep, ingrained sense of class solidarity that came from a lifetime of shared struggle. He was a permanent outsider in both worlds, too radical for the drawing rooms and too aristocratic for the pubs. This loneliness must have been acute, a price paid for the clarity of his convictions. The easy, unthinking camaraderie he had once enjoyed with his peers was gone, replaced by a solitude that even a crowded meeting hall could not alleviate. Yet, when we weigh these immense sacrifices against the opulent imprisonment of his former life, his commitment shines with an almost unbelievable intensity. The Duke he had been lived with immense material security, but was a prisoner of expectation, drowning in a sea of meaningless ritual and superficial relationships. His every action was dictated by tradition, his every opinion filtered through the lens of what was appropriate for his station. In contrast, the man he became, despite the hardship and danger, possessed something he had never known: authenticity. His life now had a purpose that resonated with his deepest moral convictions. The respect he earned from the movement was not given out of obligation to his title, but won through the power of his arguments and the genuineness of his solidarity. The fear he now faced was a fear for a cause greater than himself, a stark and noble contrast to the idle anxiety of his previous existence. Where once his security was bought with the coin of his soul, his new vulnerability was the price of his freedom. He had traded a gilded cage for a difficult, often dangerous open road, but it was a road he had chosen for himself. In every difficult step along, it was a testament to his reclaimed humanity. This intellectual revolution did not happen in a vacuum. It was fueled by a voracious and deeply personal engagement with ideas that directly challenged the very foundations of his upbringing. In the quiet solitude of his exile, surrounded by the ruins of his old life, he turned to books not as a gentleman's diversion, but as a lifeline. The library he assembled was no longer filled with dry histories of his own lineage or accounts of military campaigns. Instead, he sought out the works of radical thinkers, men and women whose names would have been anathema in his father's house. He immersed himself in the powerful arguments of John Stuart Mill, whose essays on liberty and utilitarianism offered a philosophical framework for judging a society not by its grandeur, but by the happiness and freedom of its least fortunate members. He read the economic critiques of Karl Marx, not as a convert to full-blown revolution, but as a student who recognized with chilling clarity the description of a system where labor was exploited for the benefit of a parasitic owning class, a class he now saw he had been a part of. Perhaps the most profound influence came from the works of the English romantics and social critics, like John Ruskin and William Morris. They articulated a vision that resonated deeply with his own lived experience of loss and renewal. They condemned the dehumanizing effects of the Industrial Revolution not from a dry economic perspective, but from a moral and aesthetic one. They argued that true value lay not in wealth or title, but in meaningful work, craftsmanship, and the dignity of the human spirit. For a man who had lived a life of spectacular idleness, this was a revelation. It helped him reframe the worker's struggle not just as a fight for higher wages, but as a fight for the very soul of society, a battle to reclaim human dignity from the grinding machinery of profit. These writers provided him with a language to describe the spiritual poverty of his former existence, the hollowness that lay beneath the guilt and the glamour. This reading was not a passive absorption of ideas. It was a fierce internal dialogue. He would have argued with these texts, wrestling with concepts that upended his deepest conditioning. The notion of inherent equality, for instance, was a direct assault on the doctrine of divine right and noble blood that he had been raised to believe was a natural law. To accept that a railway signalman or a factory girl possessed the same intrinsic worth as a duke required a complete dismantling of his identity. He didn't just read about democracy. He had to painfully reconstruct his understanding of human worth from the ground up, brick by brick, until the entire edifice of aristocratic superiority crumbled in his mind. This process was less like adding new information and more like undergoing a conversion, a fundamental rewiring of his conscience where empathy and a sense of universal justice began to override the ingrained habits of entitlement and hierarchy. His philosophical evolution culminated in a radical new definition of nobility itself. He began to articulate this in his speeches, turning the language of his old world on its head. I was taught that nobility was a matter of blood, he would say. I was told that my ancestors, through some feat of arms or favor of a king, had earned a perpetual claim to honor for their descendants. But I have learned that true nobility is not inherited. It is earned anew by each generation, and indeed, by each individual. It is found in the courage of the striker facing down the police baton for his family's future. It is found in the solidarity of workers sharing their last crust of bread. It is found in the unwavering commitment to justice, even when it costs you everything. This was the core of his transformation. He had moved from a world view based on accident and inheritance to one based on action and character. He ceased to be a duke in the traditional sense and became a democrat in the deepest meaning of the word, not just a believer in a political system, but an advocate for the fundamental dignity and potential of every human being, regardless of their station at birth. His journey was a testament to the power of ideas to not only change a mind, but to redeem a soul. As the decades passed and the firebrand of his youth settled into the steady warmth of conviction, the man who had once been a duke found a new role, that of an elder statesman within the very movement that had given his life meaning. This was not a formal title, but one bestowed by the quiet respect of a younger generation of activists who saw in him a living bridge to a past they had only read about. His physical presence had changed. The sharp, aristocratic angles of his face had softened with age. His hair was now a shock of white, and the hand that once held a pen with such furious intensity might have shown a slight tremor. But his eyes retained their piercing clarity, and his voice, though perhaps less thunderous, carried the weight of hard-won experience that commanded attention in any room. He occupied a unique space, revered not for the title he had abandoned, but for the profound journey he had undertaken. To young organizers grappling with the intricacies of political strategy or the despair of a failed campaign, he offered a perspective that was both philosophical and deeply practical. He could speak with the authority of someone who had known power from the inside, explaining the mindset of their opponents with an insight no textbook could provide. Yet, he also understood the emotional toll of the fight, the burnout, and the bitterness that could consume a person. His counsel was often sought in moments of crisis, and he would listen patiently before offering thoughts grounded in a lifetime of both spectacular failure and hard-fought redemption. He became a keeper of the movement's memory, reminding them of past victories that seemed impossible at the time, and of the principles that should never be compromised, even in defeat. When asked to reflect on his own dramatic life path, his responses were characteristically thoughtful and devoid of sentimentality. He expressed no nostalgia for the gilded world of his birth, which he described as a beautiful but soul-crushing illusion. He did, however, speak with a tinge of profound regret for the specific pain he had caused his wife in those early years, acknowledging that his recklessness had forced her to bear a public humiliation she never deserved. This regret was not a sign of lingering attachment to his old life, but rather a mature acknowledgement of the real human cost of his transformation. As for his choices, he expressed not just peace, but a sense of profound rightness. He often said that losing the dukedom was the greatest gift life could have given him, for it forced him to become a man, to build an identity based on something more substantial than a name in a ledger. The respect he earned within activist circles, built on shared struggle and proven solidarity, meant infinitely more to him than the deference he had once commanded by birthright. It was a respect that had to be continually earned, and that, he claimed, was what made it real. The scorn of the aristocracy, which had once felt like a mortal wound, now seemed to him like a distant, irrelevant noise. He understood that their rejection was a necessary consequence of his awakening. To be accepted by them would have meant he had failed in his mission. The quiet satisfaction of his later years came from this sense of alignment. He was no longer a man torn between two worlds, but one who had found his true home in a community bound by conscience rather than blood. He lived simply, surrounded by books and the letters of comrades, a testament to the idea that a life stripped of privilege could be immeasurably richer in purpose. His legacy was not recorded in a family Bible or on a tombstone in an ancestral crypt, but in the small, cumulative victories of the causes he championed and in the minds of those he inspired. A legacy of conscience that proved that even the most rigidly scripted life could be rewritten with courage and conviction. The role of the American fortune in this story is one of profound and layered irony, a thread that runs from the very beginning of the marriage to its final, unexpected chapters. That initial dowry, of course, was the fuel for the conflagration, the very capital the Dukes so recklessly lost, triggering their downfall. In the immediate aftermath of the scandal, the wellspring of wealth that had sustained their gilded life appeared to have run permanently dry, siphoned away by debt and disgrace. The heiress's fortune, it seemed, had served its tragic purpose. It had purchased a title and then enabled the very recklessness that destroyed it. Yet, the financial story does not end there. While the vast bulk of the dowry was irrecoverable, the heiress was not left entirely destitute. Her father, the canny industrialist, had likely structured the marriage settlement with some degree of protection, perhaps by placing a portion of her inheritance in a trust that even a profligate husband could not fully touch. Or in the wake of the scandal, her family may have intervened to secure a small, separate income for her, ensuring a basic level of survival, if not the opulence she had known. This remaining trickle of capital, a mere echo of the great fortune she had brought to the marriage, became a subject of intense private significance in their years of exile. The question of whether any of this money eventually funded his activism is not one with a simple yes or no answer. He would have been vehemently opposed to the idea of using his wife's money, the same source of his original shame, to bankroll his new life. His entire philosophy was now built on personal accountability and solidarity with the working class. To be funded by residual Gilded Age wealth would have felt like a deep hypocrisy, a betrayal of the very principles he preached. He supported himself and his work through his own efforts, the small sums earned from his writings and speeches, which he often poured directly back into the cause by funding pamphlets or supporting strikers' families. However, the financial reality of their shared life was more nuanced. That separate income secured by the heiress would have covered their most basic living expenses, the rent for their modest home, their food, their essential needs. By providing this foundation of subsistence, her remaining funds, however diminished, indirectly created the conditions for his activism. They afforded him the priceless commodity of time. He did not have to spend his days in a factory or behind a shop counter simply to put bread on the table. This financial cushion, however thin, granted him the freedom to read, to write, to travel to meetings, and to dedicate himself fully to the movement. In this light, the Gilded Age fortune, which had built a gilded cage, now unintentionally funded the intellectual and practical labor that sought to dismantle the very foundations of such inequality. The wealth that had once been a symbol of entitlement became, through a strange alchemy of fate and conviction, an unwitting patron of dissent. The ultimate fate of the heiress herself is a quieter, but equally compelling, chapter. She did not fade away or return to America to live out her days in bitter seclusion. Instead, she remained by his side, a constant, steadfast presence through decades of struggle and notoriety. Her legacy is not one of public speeches or fiery pamphlets, but of a different, more resilient form of strength. Over the long years, her initial anger and humiliation likely softened into a complex mixture of resignation, loyalty, and perhaps even a quiet, grudging respect for the man he had become. While she never became a public radical, her life became a testament to adaptation and a private kind of courage. She managed their constrained household with dignity, offered him a sanctuary from the battles of the public sphere, and provided the emotional ballast that allowed his fiery spirit to endure. In the end, the American heiress, who had been traded for a title, found a purpose that transcended that original transaction. She became the keeper of a redeemed conscience, her own story woven silently but indelibly into the fabric of his extraordinary transformation. His personal transformation unfolded against a backdrop of epoch-shifting change, a period when the very foundations of the old world were being shaken to their core. The early 20th century was not a gentle transition, but a violent upheaval, and the Duke's journey from aristocrat to activist was a single, vivid thread woven into this vast tapestry of social revolution. The comfortable certainties that had governed his youth, the divine right of kings, the natural superiority of the landed gentry, the immutability of the class system, were being challenged everywhere he looked. The rumble was not just in the union halls he now frequented. It was in the air itself, a palpable sense that history was accelerating toward an unknown future. The rise of organized labor, the cause to which he had dedicated himself, was part of a much larger global phenomenon. Socialist and communist ideas, once confined to fringe pamphlets, were now gaining mainstream political traction, promising a new world order that would sweep away the ancient privileges he personified. The 1905 Russian Revolution sent a shockwave through the courts of Europe, a stark warning of what could happen when the grievances of the masses were ignored. For every factory owner who dismissed the Duke as a madman, there was a government minister who saw in his defection a terrifying omen. He was no longer just an eccentric. He was a living symbol of the system's internal decay, proof that its own most privileged members were beginning to question its legitimacy. His arguments for workers' rights echoed the platforms of fledgling political parties that were winning seats in parliaments, demonstrating that his voice was not crying out in a wilderness, but joining a powerful and growing chorus. Then came the cataclysm of the First World War, an event that did more to dismantle the aristocratic old guard than any political treatise ever could. The war was a brutal industrial-scale slaughter that made a mockery of the notions of honor and glory that his class had cherished for centuries. The flower of a generation, including countless young men from noble families who had been his peers, was cut down in the mud of the trenches. This mass death created a profound crisis of leadership and authority. How could a system that had led the world into such a horrifying abyss possibly claim the right to rule in its aftermath? The war also accelerated social leveling. In the trenches, the son of a duke could die next to the son of a coal miner, their shared fate rendering the distinctions of birth utterly meaningless. For the duke, watching from exile, the war must have been the ultimate validation of his critique. It exposed the tragic folly of a ruling class addicted to pageantry and blind to the human cost of its decisions. In the war's grim aftermath, the decline of the aristocracy accelerated from a slow trend into a rapid collapse. Empires that had stood for centuries, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, the German, and the Ottoman, crumbled into dust, their royal families executed or sent into exile. Even in victorious Britain, the old order was on its last legs. Death duties and post-war taxation made it impossible for many great families to maintain their vast estates, which were broken up and sold off. The servant class that had sustained the aristocratic lifestyle vanished, seeking better opportunities in the new industrial economy. The world that had created the Duke was literally vanishing, its palaces emptying, its influence waning. His personal exile, once a shocking anomaly, became a metaphor for the fate of his entire class. He had not just left that world, he had, in a sense, diagnostically understood its fatal illness before the final symptoms had even appeared. His story, therefore, is more than a biography. It is a microcosm. His internal struggle, the painful shedding of inherited identity, and the conscious construction of a new one based on moral principle, mirrored the external struggle of societies trying to birth a more democratic, an egalitarian age from the ruins of aristocracy and empire. He was a man ahead of his time, not because he invented new ideas, but because he embodied a transformation that millions were undergoing in a more gradual, less dramatic fashion. He lived out in the concentrated span of a single lifetime, the violent break between the 19th and 20th centuries. While other dukes clung bitterly to their fading traditions, he had already crossed over, finding his purpose not in preserving the past, but in helping to shape a more just future. His journey demonstrates that the most significant historical shifts are not just about changing governments or economies, but about the revolutionary act of individuals changing their minds, and in doing so, becoming precursors of the world to come. This radical shift in his daily reality, from the pinnacle of the establishment to the ranks of the disenfranchised, found its most profound expression not in his speeches or writings, but in the quiet, transformative power of his personal connections. The most remarkable aspect of his story is not that he fought for the marginalized, but that he learned to stand with them, forging genuine alliances that would have been unthinkable in his previous life. This was a man who had been raised to see the working class as a faceless mass, a necessary component of the social order to be managed with paternalistic benevolence at best. And now he was sitting in their cramped kitchens, sharing a simple meal of bread and soup, and listening. He deliberately placed himself in situations where he was the student, not the teacher. He would spend hours in the noisy, grimy offices of union organizers, not to offer grand pronouncements, but to absorb the gritty details of their struggle. He learned the specific terminology of different trades, the difference between a blackleg and a scab, the intricacies of piecework pay, the particular dangers faced by miners from fire damp or textile workers from lung-clogging lint. This wasn't academic research. It was an education in the visceral reality of industrial life. The organizers, initially suspicious of this well-spoken aristocrat, soon realized he was not there to patronize them. He asked thoughtful questions, took notes with a seriousness they found disarming, and most importantly, he remembered their names and their stories. He wasn't collecting anecdotes for a speech. He was building a mental archive of human experience that would forever color his understanding of injustice. His most powerful relationships were often forged in moments of shared vulnerability. He didn't just attend rallies. He walked on picket lines, feeling the same nervous tension as the workers when company thugs or police arrived. He experienced the chilling hostility directed at strikers firsthand, the spittle of an angry foreman, the cold indifference of a magistrate. On one memorable occasion, during a violent confrontation at a dockyard, he was not spared because of his background. He was caught in the same melee, his own clothes torn, sharing the same muddy ground as the dockworkers he supported. In that moment, any remaining illusion of separation vanished. He was no longer a sympathetic observer from a higher social plane. He was another body in the struggle, equally vulnerable, equally committed. This shared experience created bonds of trust that no amount of charitable donation or eloquent writing ever could. From the women in the movement, particularly the suffragettes, who were fighting their own parallel battle for dignity and rights, he learned a different kind of courage. He had been raised in a world where women were decorative accessories, their opinions often dismissed as frivolous. The suffragettes he met were anything but. They were intellectuals, strategists, and warriors who faced not only the brutality of the state, but also the condescending mockery of society at large. He developed a deep respect for figures like Emmeline Pankhurst, whose fierce determination and organizational genius he openly admired. Through these alliances, he came to understand that the fight for justice was interconnected, that the exploitation of the worker was tied to the subjugation of women, and that a truly equitable society required the liberation of all. This was a radical expansion of his worldview, moving beyond a narrow focus on labor to a broader vision of human rights. What did he learn from them? He learned humility, first and foremost. He learned that a man who had never missed a meal had no right to lecture a man fighting to feed his family on the virtues of patience. He learned the immense value of practical knowledge, that a veteran machinist understood the rhythms and dangers of his factory floor better than any theoretical economist in London. He learned about a different kind of loyalty, one based not on blood or title, but on shared sacrifice and mutual respect. The workers and activists, in turn, learned something from him. They saw that principles could transcend class, that conscience could be stronger than conditioning. His presence among them was a powerful rebuttal to the claim that their fight was merely a case of class envy. If a man who had enjoyed every privilege was willing to risk everything to stand with them, then their cause must be rooted in a fundamental truth that resonated across the deepest social divides. This unlikely alliance became a living testament to the idea that human solidarity could be stronger than the walls of hierarchy. So, how do we measure the life of such a man? The arc is almost too dramatic to be believed, a trajectory that plunges from the sunlit peaks of hereditary privilege into the darkest valleys of public shame, only to then ascend to a summit of an entirely different kind, one built not on birthright, but on moral courage. The final breathtaking irony is that in losing everything his world valued, his title, his social standing, his wealth, he discovered a worth that was infinitely more substantial. The privilege he was born into was an accident, a lottery win of bloodline, but the integrity he forged in exile was an achievement, a victory of character earned through painful self-examination and a steadfast commitment to a cause greater than himself. This forces us to confront a provocative question. Where does true nobility truly reside? Is it in the ancient stones of a hereditary castle, or is it in the courage to stand against injustice, even when it means standing alone? For this man, nobility ceased to be a static title bestowed by a monarch and became a dynamic verb, a way of moving through the world defined by empathy, solidarity, and action. His legacy challenges us to redefine our own metrics for a life well lived. We often celebrate those who climb highest within an existing system, but his story asks us to reserve our deepest admiration for those who possess the rare courage to question the very foundations of that system, especially when they have the most to lose by doing so. His journey is, at its heart, a powerful testament to the human capacity for redemption. It proves that failure, even catastrophic, humiliating failure, need not be an end point. It can be a beginning. It can be the crucible that burns away the inessential, forcing a clarity of purpose that a life of easy comfort might never provide. His transformation whispers a hopeful truth. that it is never too late to shed a skin that no longer fits, to rewrite the script you were given, and to begin building a new identity aligned with your awakened conscience. Ultimately, his story is an enduring lesson on the nature of privilege and the responsibility it entails. He demonstrated that the greatest use of advantage is not to fortify your own position, but to leverage your unique voice and perspective to amplify those who have been silenced. He used the remnants of his platform, the education he had received, and the insider knowledge of power to become a translator for the marginalized, a bridge between worlds. He understood that unearned privilege, when left unexamined, is a corrosive force, but when confronted with honesty and wielded with humility, it can become a powerful tool for justice. As we look back on this astonishing narrative, we are left not with a simple conclusion, but with an invitation to reflection. The most lasting legacies are rarely the ones listed in history books under titles and conquests. They are the legacies of conscience, the quiet, cumulative impact of lives lived in alignment with deeply held principles. His name may not be etched on many grand monuments today, but it is woven into the fabric of a broader struggle for human dignity, a struggle that continues. His life asks each of us to consider what we would be willing to sacrifice for what we believe is right, and challenges us to build our own legacies, not on the shifting sands of status or wealth, but on the solid ground of character and conviction.